had converted, especially women, to go back to being Jewish. And for a Catholic country, that's kind of unusual. Now, the Poles were totally furious at their inability to beat the Cossacks. Prince Jeremy was really on a wild run, and they plot revenge. Originally, the Cossacks forced them to recognize that area, and the first article in the Treaty of Zbarov that they forced the Poles to sign, the first article said like this: no Jew is allowed into here. That's how much they hated the Jews. Any part that belongs to us, no Jew is allowed. They also said no Catholic priest. They said Catholic, yes, a Catholic priest. The Poles looked at this as humiliation to them. They renewed the war in 1651. Poles got a big army together for once. They put Jeremy in charge, and they smashed them. Here we go, the next one. At this Battle of Beresteczko, where you can see here's the Polish army. This is painted at that time. Here's the Polish army killing the Cossacks over here. They had, 3 cavalry charges, and they crushed their side. But once again, they wiped out 90% of the Cossacks. A year later, the Cossacks came back with another army and wiped out the Poles at the Battle of Bato. So if you really want to follow all these things back and forth, that's where it's going to go. Eventually, Khmelnytsky gave up on the Tartars. He said they keep leaving us in the middle and, being bribed off by the Poles. And he allied himself with Russia. Okay? This was fateful for the Cossacks. It was a big mistake on their part, but that's what they did. That's why Stalin liked them. They allied themselves in Russia. In the short run, this worked. Because what happened was the Russians, Moscow, got into the act, launched a huge war, an invasion of Poland all along here. So you can imagine, as I said before, living in this Meshuggah time. Up to 1648, everything was great. But from 1648, for the next 20 years or so, or 22 years, it was crazy. The world turned upside down. And it didn't get better. Because, as I say before, the Russians got in. There was a 13-year war called the Russian-Polish War of 1654 to 1667. First A invaded B, then B invaded A, and then A wiped out this army, and B wiped out that army. That's really the way it went. While the Poles had their hands full fighting the Russians, Sweden decided, let's attack. And then the Prussians said, well, then let's attack also. And so the whole Poland gets filled up with invaders, and they call it in Poland now the Mabul, this period, the potop, the deluge, right? And this is the reason, because right and left and up and down. The Jews suffer everywhere like the Poles do. Enemy armies invade and take over the country. First thing you do is rob everybody of everything. They take all the food away. And then you get starvation. Then you get, as they say, epidemics as a result of the starvation because the people are weaker. Supplies go down. Demand goes up. Even in the best of places, this whole place goes nuts. This is the period where the Russian army takes Vilna. It's very famous. For some people remember that great-grandfather Vilna Gaon had to flee to Amsterdam. We'll talk about next time. He writes the Be'er Agola, which is on the side of Shulchan Aruch, where he says, I was doing great over here, and then the next thing I know, the Russian army showed up, and anybody who didn't want to get killed, ran over the bridge and just kept running and didn't stop. This is the way it was. In other words, the whole Poland became a swamp, right? The interesting thing is that the Poles beat them, right? I tell you, they're quite remarkable. The Poles rallied, and without giving all the details, they finally got their act together under this king, and they chased these guys out, and then they chased these guys out, and in the long run, they even chased the Russians out, although they had to give up this much. So what you see over here is the eastern Ukraine, which becomes off limits to Jews as a result of this. That's the first thing the Ukrainians, the Russians said wherever they won any territories, is new Jews in here. Let me tell you something. The Cossacks who were over here, it didn't take them too long before they realized we jumped from the frying pan into the fire. Because Poland knew, if you fall into Russia, as we all know, then you're really in trouble. And little by little, the Russians, once they, as they put it, amalgamated with the Ukrainians, then little by little they closed in on them, and they took away all their rights. And the Cossacks, despite what they look like in the movies, didn't like being under the Russians and were enslaved by them, and were used as special troops, for Russian imperialistic purposes. And later on, the Russians, as I say before, the Poles, I say it wrong again. The Ukrainians came to see, look how many countries you're dealing with over here. He says, the Ukrainians came to see that maybe this whole idea wasn't the greatest idea in the world. And Ukraine never got independent until 15 years ago. You understand? Now, this thing that was in the 1600s, They remained dominated either by the Poles, in which case the domination was a little weaker, or by the Russians, in which case the domination was very strong, until the Soviet Union collapsed. And to be perfectly honest, if you follow the news, the Russians are trying to take it back right now. If you remember, they didn't like a president of Ukraine a couple years ago. Next thing you know, he came down with some bubonic plague, right? That he just must have got from smoking or something, right? The Russians have no hesitation in trying to reacquire this whole area, and the result was, chaos. I'm just going to bring. Well, that's true also, and that's another time. Bernie bring up a good point. I mean, this is another business which is Stalin, for his own reasons, caused the death of about half the people in Ukraine through deliberate starvation in the 1930s. But that's not something we're going to deal with over here right now. If you want to say you see, tit for tat and punishments, Ukraine has suffered plenty over the next several centuries. But I'm talking about when the Jews were there, and the story ends, as we see over here, with not the bad guys being defeated. Khmelnytsky just eventually died a couple years later from illness. His successor, by the way, in the Russian-Polish War, joined the Poles against the Russians, but then the Russians had him knocked out, and the next guy joined the Russians against the Poles. So everybody's being manipulated by everybody else. Jeremy's son eventually becomes the king of Poland. Prince Jeremy died in the middle of all this fighting. His son was a total fool. Michael Vishnevetsky. He wasn't like the father at all. And for the 4 years that he was a king, Poland kept going down, down, down. Even the Turks, who nobody ever heard of until now, started coming in and invading and conquering huge chunks of Polish territory. This is where the Baal Shem Tov live. All these big battles are fought. Finally, in 1672, to bring our story to a conclusion tonight, the Poles finally did one intelligent thing, and that is they picked their best general, their greatest general, to be the king, which they didn't do until they had no choice. That's the next guy over here. The guy that concludes our discussion tonight, Prince Jan Sobieski, John III. He was the king of Poland from 1672 to 1699. In other words, he gave him close to 30 years of intelligent rule. He was a great general. He defeated the Turks on a number of occasions. He reconciled the Cossacks to Poland. In other words, the Cossacks came back and said, we want to start where we were all over again. All this was for nothing. We see the Russians aren't any good. We want to go back under you, because he was an intelligent fellow. He was also, by the way, a very, very great friend of the Jews. Sobieski gave him a lot of privileges, and he even said, the Jews are an integral part of Poland. We're never going to any recovery without the Jews. And anyway, for some reason or other, he liked Jews. And everyone in Poland then undertook a certain recovery, which means that if you went after the 1660s to Poland, and this is who our great-great-great-great-great-grandparents are for most of us, then you understand that it's a generation that there were plenty of survivors, there were plenty of people who didn't survive. There wasn't a family that didn't suffer. There wasn't a family that didn't know of cases. And in eastern Poland particularly, all over the place, there were sites of, what shall I say, Kiddush Hashem. There were sites of places where lots of Jews had been killed because they were Jews. Usually, as we've seen over here, out of choice. They could have saved their lives, most of the time. Right? I haven't spoken at all about the effect on the tens and thousands, more than that, of the men and women who were carried off as slaves. Then I'm going to speak about in the aftermath, which is, I hope, next week. Not next week. Our next class is Sunday night. We're concluding this Sunday because Tisha B'Av is coming up. So we're all going to be here on Sunday night. But, yeah, same time, 8 o'clock on Sunday night. But the thing is, thank you for reminding me, but the thing is that this gave a very tragic but martyr-like quality to Polish Jewish life. This, in an interesting way, strengthened the faith because of the particular reaction that the Jews had to it, which was very different than came after the Holocaust. It's not exactly like a Holocaust because plenty of Jews survived. But on the other hand, tens of thousands were killed in the worst kinds of ways. There are debates that will never be settled among the historians as to how many people were killed. And so they vary from 30,000 or so to 150,000, some say even more. Obviously, when you get these kind of debates, so you end up with something in the middle. You understand? If we want to have a general idea, there's no way to know. If we want to have a general idea, it's how you tweak the sources. And I hope, if you paid close attention to what I've been reading and discussing over here, sometimes the sources themselves are very vacuous. They give hints. It's not easy to tell what exactly they mean. The human cost was enormous, but add to the killed people the tens of thousands and more who were carried off as slaves, and sometimes to fate worse than death, or sometimes sold off to slavery in the Mediterranean area, which is something I hope to speak about next time. And so, just as the destruction of Beis Hamikdash on Tisha B'Av had an aftermath as well, in which we have stories of boys and girls being carried off as captives to Rome and things like this, or the fact that the Chachamim, after the Beis Hamikdash destroyed, spent years when they never davened because they were working 24/7 on Pidyon Shvuyim. Very similar kinds of things happened in the aftermath of these terrible outbreaks over here, except that they took place in a Poland which was exploding all around them, because for 20 years after 1648, the country was seething with war.